Chapter 7. The King's Man. That winter proved to be one of the harshest on record. For about a month the castle was covered in almost 18 inches of snow. The roads to the nearby villages proved to be virtually impassable. When spring appeared, it came with a vengeance, sweeping away the old vestiges of winter and replacing them with its own image. Spring brought the land back to life with a burst of colour and the revelation that Alicia, Greyful's wife, was already pregnant with her second child. For Race, things had changed a lot too. Anyone who didn't know better would probably swear that Race was at least 2 years old, maybe even 3. He could already walk short distances, and he enjoyed settling down on the floor at the feet of his step-parents and playing with the toys they had bought him. Occasionally, he would even hold short conversations with people. While his language skills at this age were still very simple, he could usually make himself understood. The Duke was especially proud of his new son. It might almost seem as if he had forgotten that little Race wasn't actually the fruit of his loins. Race didn't just grow quickly, he seemed to learn quickly too, and he was always hungry for knowledge about the world around him. Indeed, the main topic of conversation amid the servants and the guards often seemed to be just how quickly the young boy was growing. Some even speculated that the boy had been bewitched, something that was hard to deny when he was being taken to Manglos regularly on the first day of every month. The Duke didn't mind such speculation too much, though. He would rather that people assume what they did than they should ever discover the truth. One of the worst people for such gossiping was Race's nanny. It would have been hard to hide the boy's growth rate from his own nanny, especially since she had little Minnie Tilda to compare him with. Race was a toddler, while Minnie Tilda, younger than him by only 13 days, was still little more than a baby. Clarina seemed to have a soft spot for Race. "He's always such a good boy," she said. Clarina had taken a seat in the great hall today and was watching Race at play while she held the sleeping Minnie Tilda. Race's favourite toy hadn't been, as his father had thought it might, a set of wooden soldiers that his brother Greyfulf had bought for him. The Duke always suspected that Greyfulf, who had otherwise wanted nothing to do with the boy, had deliberately bought those to show that Race had a violent side. No, Race preferred to play with some small wooden building blocks. He wasn't much of a skilled architect yet, but he did enjoy building small walls and then knocking them down so he could build another. Then, on this day, as Race was beginning the construction of yet another wall, a man wearing the full uniform and livery of one of the Duke's guards entered the hall. "Forgive me for disturbing you, Your Grace," the guard said, "but there is a herald at the gate." A herald? The Duke stood up, accidentally catching Race's toy wall with his foot and knocking it over. Some boy of Race's age, upon having their hard work suddenly ruined, would have begun to cry. Race never cried. Harpies had no tear ducts. That was true that Race's human body did have them. Race wasn't able to use them. Never crying was one of the things that made Race stand out. This time, though, Race barely shrugged his shoulders. It wasn't as if his father had done it on purpose. "From the king," the guard clarified. "I see," the Duke said. "Well, I guess you'd better show him in." "Yes, Your Grace," the guard replied. He saluted and then turned to leave the hall. The Duke looked down at his son and then looked at the toys scattered across a small part of the floor at his feet. "Race?" "Yes, Daddy," Race said without looking up. "Would you mind packing your toys up for now? We want to set a good example for our guest." "But Daddy," Race protested, "I'm busy." "Please, son," the Duke asked. "We want the King's man to think well of us." Race didn't reply, nor did he argue any further. He just started to pick up his bricks and put them away in the box from which he had gotten them. Under normal circumstances, he would most likely have left the blocks in the middle of the floor once he had finished playing with them. It would have been down to someone else to clear them away, or to order Race to put them away. He was different than human boys of his apparent age in many ways, but he wasn't always that different. Once he had cleared away his bricks, Race found a spare chair close to Clarina and sat there quietly, watching the large doors at the end of the hall for the King's herald to appear, his attention occasionally distracted by the sleeping form of Minnie Tilda. For some reason, Race often seemed to find Minnie Tilda fascinating, and would sometimes even spend hours just looking at her. Then the 2 guards, whose job it was to protect those in the great hall from unannounced interruptions, suddenly opened the great doors and allowed the herald to pass. The herald strode in as if he owned the place. His uniform was almost pure white in colour. He wore a fur-lined cape and both a breastplate and an open-face helmet trimmed with feathers. He wore no other armour of any kind. The herald strode purposely across the great hall and then bowed deeply towards the Duke. The king sends his greetings and asks me to inform you that he shall be arriving within the hour. The king is coming here, now, the Duke said, shocked. It wasn't that he didn't want to see the king, but he liked his kitchen staff to have some sort of warning if there was going to be a feast of some description. The herald ignored the comment. The king wishes me to inform you that he apologises that he didn't get here sooner, but there were affairs of state that had to be attended. Please, the Duke said, return to the king and tell him we would be delighted to receive him. The herald bowed deeply again and then strode out of the great hall in much the same manner that he had entered. The Duke stood up. There was so much to do. The great hall was a mess and the king would be arriving in less than an hour. He called over one of the nearby guards. Tell the servants to come here and clean this room now. I want it spotless within the hour. Also, prepare some of the spare rooms. The king will have 4 mages and maybe as many as 20 knights with him. We might be able to house the knights in the barracks, but the king might insist that they are housed near him. Your grace, the soldier replied with a bow. The Duke didn't wait to watch the soldier carry out his orders. Instead he turned his attention to Race. Clarina, would you take Race and Minitilda up to the nursery and keep them there? Why, Daddy? Race asked. He was a little bothered by the suggestion. I wanted to see the king. I'm sorry, Race, the Duke told him. I do have my reasons. The king is coming to see me and you might prove too much of a distraction for him. Well, Race said, both looking and sounding a little upset. I guess if it will make you happy. Good boy, the Duke told him. The hour passed slowly and painfully for the Duke. The servants seemed to take forever before they even entered the great hall to start cleaning, and then they took their own good time about it. Fortunately, the king didn't arrive on time. It was a little longer than an hour before he arrived at the castle, and the servants actually had plenty of time to finish their work, leaving the Duke a great hall in which he would be proud to entertain the king. Everything was ready in time for the king's arrival. The drawbridge of Castle Damoth, being so close to the border with the elves, was usually kept shut. When the king arrived, it had already been opened in readiness. Then, as the king's horse stepped onto the castle grounds, a band of musicians made up of soldiers from various regiments within the castle played a fanfare, followed by the country's national anthem. There was also a lot of cheering from the peasants of the castle as the king dismounted and, followed closely by his entourage, crossed the courtyard towards the residency. Little Ray sat on the window ledge of the nursery with his knees tucked under his chin, watching as the king crossed the courtyard. It made his little heart leap with joy to see such pomp and circumstance. I wish I was down there. I don't see that there would have been any harm, Clarina said. She was also at the window, watching the pomp from a slightly higher vantage point. She had secured the baby Minitilda in her crib and had left her there for a minute or so she too could see the king. Your father was very insistent, though. Maybe the next time the king visits he'll consider you old enough to stay downstairs. Race didn't reply and continued to watch the king. There were a number of people with the king, but he didn't know who any of them were, only that neither of the women looked old enough to be the king's wife. Then, for a moment, he felt as if a hand of ice had grabbed his heart. One of the king's entourage had looked up at the window, looked right at him, and seemed to be looking through him. Race hopped off the ledge and shook his head until the feeling left him. Are you all right? Clarina asked. I'm fine, Race replied shakily. A little dizzy is all. By the time Race returned to the window, the king had already entered the building. The king was directed straight through to the great hall. The Duke's guards were either standing to attention as he passed, or opening the doors in plenty of time so that nothing detained the king longer than necessary. When the king entered the great hall itself, the Duke was standing in the middle of the room, his wife holding his arm. Greyforth and his wife stood a little to the left of the Duke, while Tia and Jenny, also having been summoned to the great hall, bracketed their parents. King Erestine, sometimes known as Erestine I, had been king for less than 2 years. The last time he had visited the Duke and his family, his father, King Goti V, had been on the throne. He walked across the floor of the great hall every bit as regally as his father ever had. He stopped in the middle of the room, directly opposite the Duke. His entourage fanned out about him. The Duke and his family immediately fell to their knees in honour of their liege. Please get up, the king said. It'd be very hard to hold a conversation with you down there. The Duke did as he was bid. The rest of the Duke's family followed suit. I'll dispense with the introductions, the king said. I think you know my children. The king had 3 children. Princess Maribella was 16 years old. She was a pretty girl, but tended to wear too much makeup. Then there was Prince Goatee, now 15 years of age. Finally, there was Princess Alice. She was 9, and in that stage of life where she liked to dress similarly to her sister. Princess Alice was also carrying a small wooden doll. Indeed, my liege, the Duke replied respectfully. I think you also know my mage advisors, the king said. There were 3 mage advisors with the king, Graston, Klemper, and Thalid. Each of them dressed in a different way, and yet they all had the same feel to them. Each of them carried a small ironclad staff about the size of a walking stick. Each of them also wore long robes and a cape, although they were all of different styles and colours. Graston had a thick, bushy beard. Thalid also had a beard, though it was very short, and Klemper had no beard, and was the youngest of the 3 by far. I thought you had 4 mages, the Duke commented. I did, the king admitted. I'm afraid that Cranentham was caught using his magic to swindle some of the local shopkeepers out of their hard-earned savings. You locked him up? The Duke asked. The king shook his head and replied, No, I had him executed. The Duke was a little shocked at this. The old king had been a lot more moderate in his treatment of criminals. By contrast, this seemed a harsh punishment for the crime, but he wasn't about to question his king's judgment. The king looked away from the Duke for a moment, turning his attention to Tyr. You're 17, aren't you, lad? Yes, sire, Tyr replied proudly, yet nervously. Good, the king said. I guess I'll see you in the palace sometime next year for your knighthood. Yes, sire, Tyr repeated. The king nodded. You look like a good, healthy lad. I could use more knights like you. Let's set a date for 2 weeks after you turn 18. That should allow you plenty of time to celebrate properly first. Make sure your father contacts me ahead of time. I can't keep track of every nobleman in my land. I will, sire. Thank you, sire, Tyr said quickly. For now, though, what I have to say is for the ears of the knights of your family only. Would you be so kind as to take your sister Jenny and show my children around the castle? I'd be delighted, Tyr responded. He bowed low before his king. Jenny curtsied. There was a moment of chaos as Tyr headed for the doors out of the great hall. Jenny and the king's children were close on his tail. The Duke watched, slightly amused. He knew what would happen once they were beyond those doors. Tyr would split off with Princess Maribella, and Jenny would be left looking after Prince Goatee and Princess Alice. The Duke then turned his attention to his wife. I think you'd better go too, love. As you wish, the Duchess replied. She gave her husband an understanding smile, and then threw a curtsy for the king, before she followed her children out of the great hall. Alicia accompanied her, having received much the same request from her husband. The king turned his head and watched the women leave the room. I didn't bring my wife, he said. She was feeling a little under the weather. I'm sorry, the Duke replied. Can't be helped, the king said. Can't be helped. The doors of the great hall closed behind the women. I wanted to come here 8 months ago, but affairs of state got in the way, if you know what I mean. Yes, sire, the Duke answered. And then winter came, and closed virtually all the roads. You've been totally cut off for the last month. I half expected to find the Pointers in charge of this castle when I arrived, the king joked. Pointers, my liege? The Duke asked. Elves, the king replied. He brushed his hands over his ears and repeated, Pointers. No, my liege, the elves have been quiet for nigh on 200 years, the Duke commented. The king nodded. Except for that little incident last year. What little incident would that be, sire? The Duke asked. When the Pointies crossed the border and built a village on your lands. I read the reports of how they attacked your villagers, hunted the local game and so on. It was all there, in your report, the king explained. That was harpies, my king, not elves, the Duke responded. The king gave the Duke a dirty look to indicate that he didn't like being corrected. No matter. They came south from the elven lands, didn't they? They must have, my liege, the Duke agreed, unhappy with where this seemed to be going. Well, there you are then, the king said. The Pointies were probably behind it in the first place. The Duke started. Then he saw the look in the king's eye and finished with, Yes, my liege. The king nodded and said, Well, we can't allow them to think they can get away with it. I've brought the royal army with me. They're currently camped out in the forest between here and Lamington. Tomorrow, I plan to lead them across the border to the city of Golspon. Merely a punitive measure. You understand. But my king, the Duke said, horrified, that could bring open war with the elves. Then let there be war, the king said. He began to sound as if he was preaching. In a straight one-on-one fight, our soldiers can outmatch theirs any day. Each one of our knights is capable of killing 10 pointies without even breaking a sweat. They must be mad to even think of challenging us. Just imagine all the glory on offer. I could be the first king in over 500 years to actually extend our borders beyond where they are now. Let there be war. They wouldn't dare stand against us. The Duke didn't like it. For one thing, his castle was right on the border of the Elven lands. In a war, it would be the first target of attack. I wouldn't worry, the king said. These pointies don't have the heart for war. What do you want me to do? The Duke asked resignedly. He could argue against the attack until he was blue in the face, but he recognised the look in the eyes of the king. His mind had already been made up before he left the capital. The fact that it wasn't the elves that had invaded his land after all this was a minor detail that could easily be ignored. I've brought enough men with me for the assault. Just to be sure, though, I would like you and your army standing close by, just in case we need them. Primarily, though, I need a place to ensure the safety of my children. Goatee will ride with me, of course. He's 15 and has yet to taste battle. But I'd like to make sure my daughters are safe. I thought I could leave them here with you until my return to the capital. We would be delighted, the Duke acquiesced. And I'm sure my wife would love to look after your daughters while we go to war. Good, the king said. Now, if you would have someone show me to my room, I'd like to freshen up for dinner. Of course, the Duke replied. I won't be staying the night, though, the king clarified. I have to get back to camp and get the army on the move. I want us to be in position by dawn tomorrow, and siege equipment doesn't move very fast. With the king out of the way until dinner, the Duke retreated to his study. Inform Sir Richmond that I want to see him, he ordered one of the guards. The city of Goldspawn was one of the few places outside of the dukedom that were actually depicted on the map. This is a mistake, the Duke said to himself. What is a mistake? Sir Richmond asked. The Duke hadn't even heard Sir Richmond open the door, let alone enter. The Duke shook his head. Some months ago you told me that the elves were building up their forces in the city of Goldspawn, fortifying it on the off chance that the goblins might attack. Do you remember? Yes, I remember. I think that may have been about 9 months ago, Your Grace. It was just before you adopted your new son, as I recall, Sir Richmond replied. 9 months, really? Oh, well, no matter, the Duke commented. What I want to know is how well defended is that city now? Well, the elves stopped pouring troops into that city about 3 months ago, Sir Richmond responded. Good, the Duke said. They haven't yet begun to remove any, though. At the last count, I estimate there might be as many as 100,000 elvish warriors secreted behind the city walls. That number doesn't include the citizens, any and all of whom could conceivably take up arms if it were necessary. It didn't take long for the Duke to work out the maths. He had just over 2,000 men in the castle, with another possible 1,000 he could recruit from the militias of the nearest villages. He could also get the 3,000 troops that were currently stationed in Lamington, but that would mean leaving the city effectively defenceless. If war was coming, those troops would be needed. The Duke shook his head. Even if the king brought every professional soldier from his capital with him, leaving the capital defenceless, they wouldn't stand a chance.